Thank you very much, Pat Doherty, Member of Parliament, for an insightful journey through a very long and difficult history. Thank you very much, Carlos Rodriguez and the Cuba Study Group for convening this and bringing me here. And my dear friend, Wendy Lewis from the Project on Justice in a Time of Transition, for making me believe that this is a doable exercise and I need not be afraid. And also our leaders of faith and members of the diplomatic corps who are here. My dear friends, I want to really start off with a little story and I'll end off with hopefully something scriptural. But the story is really one of a man who, one very dark night, walks down the road and sees someone else crouching under a street lamp, searching for something. And he goes up to him and he says, "Can I help you?" He says, "Well, I've lost my car keys." And he helps him to search it. And after 5, 10, 15 minutes, they realize that they're not finding anything. So he says to the man, "Are you sure you lost it here? Because we're not finding it." The man says to him, "I don't think I lost it here, but this is the only place where the light is shining." And so the story that we heard from Father Schreiter this morning, the story that we heard from Pat Doherty this morning, is about the courage to get out to the unlit areas where we've lost our car keys. Far too often, we search only where our memory has guided us to, where our history lights up, the space where we are familiar with the language, where we know the people, where we nurse our wounds and find comfort in our victimhood, and are therefore reticent to move to the areas where the keys can be found. And that's the long story of South Africa. And like Pat Doherty, I simply want to give you a bird's eye view of a 300-year history of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. And I say that because we are all familiar with what we sometimes call the miracle of South Africa. And while coming from a Muslim tradition, I do believe in miracles. I think that when you call something a miracle and you ignore how a miracle evolves over 300 years, you begin to believe that there is no place for human agency, that what happened in South Africa cannot be done by ordinary human beings elsewhere in the world. I've picked up a tendency to deify Nelson Mandela, to call what he has done a miracle, and then to say it's impossible to do it between the Palestinians and the Israeli. We don't have a Nelson Mandela. And the moment you call it a miracle, you deactivate yourself and you remove yourself as an agent of the divine, a human agent, and someone with a capability to really get into the unlit areas and do the brave thing. And that really, I think, is what we need to understand. 300 years ago, we had conquest and slavery, starting off in my hometown of Cape Town and spreading over southern Africa, where the Khoi and the San, the original people who encountered the Dutch when they arrived, have literally been wiped out. There's almost been a genocide. Their language has to be reconstructed from fragments because it doesn't exist as a language to speak about. And where my ancestors, the Malays, were brought to Cape Town as slaves and as exiles from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places conquered by the Dutch. With the discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa, a bitter competition between two colonial powers, the Dutch and the British, ensued, eventually won by the British. And that ushered in, at the turn of the century, towards the 1900s, ushered in a period of segregation and colonialism. And I mention that because we may often find it more comfortable to blame a group of Afrikaners, people of Dutch descent, for the whole history of South Africa, and forget that there was an intervening period where the British had laid the basis of much of this segregation that we had experienced, laid the basis for the homeland system, like the Indian reservation system. And then in 1948, with the victory in the white elections of the National Party, they perfected the art of apartheid, of not only separating people, but dispossessing people. And perfecting a machinery to enforce it, perfecting a legal system. If you do not understand the depth of apartheid, you don't understand how land was divided into group areas and people moved into it if you were the right group, or out of it if you were not the right group. How schools were segregated, how they spent time on segregating not only schools but curricula. Blacks were not allowed to learn maths and science. And if you want to understand the origin of the unemployability that we have in South Africa, then you've got to understand that in today's competitive economy, you cannot have people who have not seen the inside of a math or a science textbook. I want to further say that South Africa is a diverse society. We've got all these layers of colonial people, whether they be the French Huguenots who came, whether they were the Portuguese who migrated southwards when the Portuguese colonies collapsed, whether they were the Dutch colonials or the British, and those soldiers who came for the Anglo-Boer War from Scotland and everywhere else to settle there. Then you've got African tribes who have settled, Asians who came as indentured laborers from India to work on the sugar fields of South Africa, which brought Mahatma Gandhi to South Africa just over 100 years ago. And then colored people who were the remnants of the Khoi and the San, the Malays who came there as slaves, and people generally of mixed origin. And that creates the very kind of diverse and complex society that we are. We've got the most diverse and dynamic economy on the continent of Africa. We are able to export today to the USA anything from oranges to diamonds, right to every C-Class Mercedes-Benz that drives in the USA is made in South Africa. That's how diverse and dynamic the South African economy is. Against that, we've probably got one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, which measures the gap between your highest income earners and your lowest income earners. And the closer you go to one, the more unequal your society is, and we're at 0.68. It could be understandable if it wasn't color-coded. And that makes of South Africa a tenuous society. Because when the black person comes from the shack with no water and no electricity and looks after the children of the one who lives in a 8-bedroom mansion, the disparity stares at you every day. And hence the kind of tragedies we've had at our mines in recent times. We've got huge social backlogs in education, in health, in welfare, and all of those kind of things. And so we did not have the luxury. If our society were to hold, and the reconciliation were to hold, we needed to create a safety net for those who could not find their wherewithal in the economy, as well as those who are unemployable, despite their will to work. And therefore we've constructed a safety net that consists of benefits that the state would give people. And I thought that maybe just that snapshot of a 300-year history and how we have arrived today is very important. The struggle against apartheid has been as old as the first arrival over 300 years ago. The last anti-colonial tribal uprising was crushed at the turn of the century, just before we reached the year 1900. The ANC was formed in 1912, which makes it the oldest liberation movement in Africa and celebrates its centenary this year. It was formed in 1912 largely by people of faith, priests, and largely of middle-class origin in order to oppose a law that was going to come in 1913, which was the 1913 Land Act, which effectively took 80% of the population and put them into 13% of the land, and the rest of the land, the 77%, would effectively be in the hands of a white minority. That group of ANC leaders were gentlemen in both the gender sense of the word as well as in the sense of the word that speaks to their tactics. They loaded some of their eminent leaders onto a ship one day to go and visit Queen Victoria, to appeal to her, to please be kinder to the blacks in South Africa. And for many decades they persisted with the ability of petitions, with appeals and delegations to whoever were willing to listen to them to alleviate the plight. It was in the 1920s when South Africa industrialized rapidly at the hand of diamonds and gold coming to the surface in great numbers, and them needing this cheap black labor to come in to Johannesburg and places like that, that a worker consciousness developed. And ironically, it was largely the East European communists who came to South Africa fleeing the gulags and all of those, and largely of Jewish origin, who created firstly a communist party in South Africa, and secondly a militancy in South Africa. And so we've had a 1924 white worker strike calling for the establishment of a white worker republic. These tactics translated into blacks, and by the 1940s we had massive uprisings in the mines that was partly responsible for the National Party coming to power, promising the white electorate a suppression of all of this activism. And so, as the National Party came to power, so did the ANC radicalize. And that was when Nelson Mandela was a member of the ANC Youth League with O.R. Tambo and other comrades of his. And they took over the leadership of the ANC and said, let us go back to the tactics and strategies of Mahatma Gandhi, Satyagraha, a militant passive resistance. And the 1950s saw massive uprisings of that kind of militant, peaceful nature. The last campaign was the burning of passes which every black had to carry and could subject you to jail if you were in a city without it. And that led to the burning of passes in Sharpeville. And on that day in 1960, 69 people were shot, most of them in the back. That was, firstly, the most brutal suppression that the apartheid state was capable of, and that was the moment at which Nelson Mandela understood that even the militant, passive resistance was not going to be sufficient. And he became the first commander of the African National Congress's guerrilla army, Umkhonto weSizwe, or the Spear of the Nation. And I say this because it begins to really deal with the issue of whether we're dealing with almost little gods, or whether we're dealing with people who have evolved with the history of South Africa. Nelson Mandela did not come as a gentle soul to the world. His 27 years in prison was his battle with his soul. He was the founding commander of the guerrilla army, an angry young man who overthrew the old leaders of the ANC. And like Moses, after his intemperate action in the court of Pharaoh, or like Jonah learning patience in the belly of the whale, and every other prophet, Nelson Mandela too had to discipline his soul for the task ahead of him. It wasn't much later that Nelson Mandela and the whole leadership of the ANC was locked up for life in Robben Island, the prison off the coast of Cape Town. The rest of the leadership fled before they could be caught, and O.R. Tambo led the ANC from Lusaka in Zambia. The world did roaring trade with South Africa because South Africa was on the gold the world was mostly on the gold standard, and we had what the world wanted: bullion. And that was the greatest boom that South Africa experienced. And for that decade, resistance had been crushed. It was in the 1970s that the revival of that resistance began to emerge again. It started off with the dock workers' strike in 1976, 1973 in Durban, the Soweto students' uprising, where on one day 500 children were shot in a peaceful march in Soweto that inflamed the country. And with the overthrow of the Portuguese in Mozambique by Frelimo, suddenly a new future seemed possible for South Africa. And therefore we knew then that we were on the final stretch towards freedom. It was almost to the day this week, 35 years ago, that Steve Bantu Biko was tortured to death in the prisons of South Africa. And it was in the 1980s that probably the greatest mass movement formed in South Africa, the United Democratic Front, because the ANC itself was banned. That entire struggle stood on four pillars: the mass mobilization, the political underground, the guerrilla army, and the international isolation of South Africa. And that is where people in the United States, despite who was in the White House, refused to buy South African goods, marched outside our embassy, pressurized their leaders to introduce sanctions against South Africa. This happened almost all over the world because the anti-apartheid struggle had caught the moral imagination of the world. It was a way to be good for many people in the world. What I think is important also is that the seeds of how a struggle sometimes ends is laid in how a struggle is conducted. And so we understood always that we were never against white people. We were against the system of apartheid. It's the ability to distinguish between the individuals and the people who make up a system and the system itself. And hence, no UDF or ANC platform was without a white person speaking against apartheid. Whether it is Father Trevor Huddleston, or whether it is Joe Slovo, or whoever the case may be, because we needed to teach blacks as well that here is a white who is not like those who are oppressing you, and therefore we can't hate whites. But at the same time, we denounced blacks who worked with the system to show that we were as capable of bad things. That was a very important distinction. Other key distinctions, and I raise this because I come from a Muslim background, and the Muslim world is in deep trouble, and so I find myself, whether it is with a brotherhood across North Africa or whether it is with a range of other Muslim groups, to teach these distinctions as they try to navigate a different path in the world today. How can you have a struggle or a movement that is militant but not violent, that is radical, that goes to the roots of things but not fundamentalist, that is revolutionary, that wants to change things but not extremist? And those are the elusive distinctions in the world today, and hence we see the kind of things that's happening, particularly today across the Muslim world, the inability to make those distinctions. And some of us may not have the wherewithal for violence, the wherewithal for fundamentalism, the wherewithal for extremism. But it doesn't make us sometimes less violent, less extreme in the attitudes that we bring to a problem. And we've got to examine how we can drive those distinctions, how to be right but not to do wrong. And those become absolutely critical lessons that we've learned outside of South Africa. Our transition to democracy more or less coincided with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because suddenly, when the Berlin Wall fell, Africa was no longer an important theater for the Cold War. And so we understood that while it was intensely personal and national for us, that we were inserted into bigger realities that we didn't always understand. And each one of us has to examine whether the bigger reality has shifted sufficiently for us now to get over some of our national and personal and community considerations. When that opportunity opened up, that Ronald Reagan no longer needed to prop up apartheid in order to keep out the communists, things became possible, peace became possible, a resolution became possible. So there was a shift in the global balance. The ANC immediately seized on this by going to the frontline states, our neighboring states, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia, and so forth, as well as to the Organization for African Unity with the Harare Declaration, in which we began to lay the basis for discussion, because we knew that there are windows which open in life, and if you don't go through them, they close again. And then you will forever live with your timidity. And we understood at that moment what courage meant. Courage is not the opposite of cowardice. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. Courage is the perfect middle. Because you have the ability, when you are courageous, to have enough caution and to avoid recklessness. And therefore, each one of us has to find within ourselves our courage. And that is where we knew that we had to get through that window, and the ANC grasped the Harare Declaration to build a consensus that the time for dialogue has come. But we also sold that Harare Declaration inside the country amongst all the forces of liberation to say to them, the time has come to talk. And we understood, because we had learned that in those talks we had to set a framework, but not a detail for the talk, because you had to give the leadership a mandate that was open enough. And so we understood the notion of adherence to principle, flexibility of tactics. In confusing sometimes principle and tactics, we try to give our leadership a mandate that is so tight that if someone just once says no, they are compelled to walk out. And so how do we create an adherence to principles and objectives, but a flexibility of strategies and tactics? But it happens when you have trusted leadership, tested leadership, like Nelson Mandela and others. And so a step that we have to learn amongst ourselves first is to invest each other with trust, to believe in the bona fides of each other, and to understand that those whom we invest that trust in are so steeped in us that the instincts beat with us. It's not being foolish, but it is not also being foolish in not investing trust for people to go and to see where that path takes them. At that same time, we understood that we needed also not to treat our so-called enemy, the National Party or the Afrikaners, as a monolith. Because that's the other thing that we do. We paint everyone with the same brush. And we are so filled with righteous fury that we do not see the schisms and the gaps amongst them. And so we started to say to the intelligentsia, listen, you have more intelligence than P.W. Botha, the President of South Africa. You know that this is unsustainable. Come and talk to us. To go to the sports people, especially those in rugby, and you've seen many of you Invictus, to know how important rugby is, to go to the sports people and say, you are probably the world champions, but you are not allowed to play. We give you the opportunity to play. Come and talk to us. To say to business people, we cannot afford to implode that which we hope to inherit. We can't destroy so utterly the economy that we all want to inherit one day. Let's take the step right now. And when we began to probe, we found on the other side the necessary takers. It's when you treat your enemy as a monolith that you make enormous strategic mistakes, because you can't see the opportunities, the real agents for change amongst the others. Sometimes you are right to have fury, but you must never have a righteous fury that blinds you to the opportunity to do good. And the mantra of the ANC was, we isolate only our most extreme enemy and invite everyone else to us. And we unite the broadest possible coalition around us, except those who will compromise us in our principles. Now, if we work between those two mantras, how do we possibly begin to dissect, as we dissected, the Afrikaner monolith and isolated them, so much so that their right wing broke away and formed their own party, but weakened themselves irrevocably. And by splitting off from the National Party, they weakened the National Party so much that the National Party needed other people to look after them. And so it's in these tactics and strategies that I think we need to be able to move forward. And then we began to know each other. We invited people to Dakar to just have talks. We then moved on from getting to know each other opportunities to really beginning to have talks about talks, to examine what are the possibilities and the limitations that we have initially with us, so that we understood how far you can go now and what the things are that hold you back. And then to use that to begin to shape an agenda for discussions. It was then that we went to CODESA and did much the same thing, have an inclusive, an all-inclusive process, but take out a warranty that between the two big parties, you create the basis for sufficient consensus. It's all in, but no one has a veto to hold you back. When the two big parties, the ANC on the one side and the National Party on the other side, are prepared to move forward, there's sufficient consensus. And then, very importantly, don't give anyone a veto. I met with some Palestinians the other day and I said, your problem is that so many of you have the trigger on the veto in that Middle East peace process. If Hamas fears that Fatah and Israel will reach an agreement, they just need to fire a rocket. Israel withdraws. The peace talk ends. On the other side, when progress is made between the Palestinians and the Israelis, you just need one general to raise something, or a right-wing person to occupy a piece of land. You can't give the veto away. One needs to understand how to protect the right to veto, to the point of not having a veto over what must be discussed. In our discussions, we understood the need to give our antagonists, the National Party, enough to go back with to comfort their constituency. Because we understood one very important principle. We are each other's keepers. Once you start engaging, we are each other's keepers. Because the process of initial engagement means that the ANC may be dislocated from the more radical elements within the liberation movement, and the National Party from the more conservative elements in the apartheid state. And once you move to the center, you tend to leave behind people on the extremes. But once you move, you've got to be each other's keepers. And so we needed to develop what we called sunset clauses, that as the sun sets on apartheid and on white hegemony, how do we make it comfortable for them? And so, for example, we had a government of national unity provision for 5 years, where Nelson Mandela would be president, and if F.W. de Klerk gets sufficient votes, he would be vice president. And according to their votes, that's how they will share the cabinet and the legislature of South Africa. After 300 years of struggle, what's 5 more years of compromise? We did sunset clauses to give job security for white civil servants, but to do it in a way that they became the servants of the nation and not of an ideology. And that was Nelson Mandela's particular charm, that he was able to even counter the idea of counter-revolution from the army and the police, largely white bodies in South Africa. We held the prospect of amnesty as something that we will do. Our constitution incorporated the recognition of 11 languages as official languages of South Africa. We built inclusiveness in it. Our flag has the most colors of any country seeks, because it shows the convergence of the liberation movement with the National Party, with a white color in between. And so those were the ways in which we began to build out the sense of inclusiveness. But we understood that we needed to move towards reconciliation, and instead of going only for reconciliation, we established under the leadership of Archbishop Tutu the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and set up truth and reconciliation almost as tradable commodities. If you told the truth, you'd move us towards reconciliation. There's no sweeping under the carpet. The hard truths had to come out. And if you did that successfully, not only would you get reconciliation, you'd also get amnesty. If you refused to be truthful about your role, you would have to face a court and go to jail. So there was a hard edge to it, given that whole history that I've outlined for you. We needed to have a disclosure of the truth. But it was at that moment that we began to understand, when we worked out this truth and reconciliation and the future shape of our society, that we needed to understand what justice means, because that was the demand, the central demand for 300 years. We want justice. And we understood three definitions of justice. The one was absolute justice, as applied at Nuremberg. That's the justice of the victor, who with righteous fury can go and deal with the perpetrators. We understood that that was neither allowed for by the times nor desirable for healing the nation, and therefore made a combination of transitional justice and restorative justice. And transitional justice, we understood, was justice which takes you from where you are to where you want to be. If you have no sense of your objective, you can apply absolute justice. But if you knew your destination and you needed to get there, you needed the application of justice that got you there. There are so many of us who want to get to a place, but in the road that we take, we destroy any prospect of getting to that place. And restorative justice responded to the need for us as South Africans to overcome the dispossession that we had suffered through the Land Act, through group areas, through other acts of dispossession. And so we introduced to our body politic those two notions of justice, transitional and restorative. It was in that context that reconciliation was an exchange, not a gift. It was an exchange for truth. It had to be the security policeman who tortured someone to death and buried his body somewhere in a field, to take the mother to it and to take out those bones with the parents and to be able to say, I'm very sorry for what I have done. I ask your forgiveness. And so it wasn't forgiveness that was uncontextual. It was forgiveness that was absolutely in the context, in the extreme cases, of taking the family and the parents to the body and looking the mother and the father in the eye and saying, please forgive me. It was only when those circumstances coincided that forgiveness, and it was not the state who pardoned, it had to start with the family. And we were very blessed with some of the most gentle people on whom some of the most horrific things had been done, to have a capacity that was so fulsome to forgive, because by that time we understood that there was a further place to go than simply to salve my own hurt and my own injury. We were able to put our individual injuries in the context of the injury of a nation and the need for the nation to heal itself and to move down the line. We needed to deal with our memory. Was our memory going to be the transfer of resentment, of bitterness, and of revenge to the next generation? Or was it a resolve that such a tragedy will never ever fall on our nation again, and that it must forever be a lesson to the rest of the world? And we chose the latter. But we understand that in that, we must not rush in South Africa to a post-racial world while we are still healing the wounds. Because sometimes we apply all the language of post-racialism and we bury resentments and hurts and injuries under it. We needed to reconstruct our identity, get away from the racial epithets that has been inculcated in us for 300 years. Need to define the mode of our coexistence, because it's easy to go into an isolationist coexistence where we are atomized communities side by side without contact. It's easy to take the assimilationist one, where we all leave who we are at the boundary and come into a new South Africanism. Or do we integrate our integrities, where I can be a proud South African, but I can be a Muslim South African. I can be a Muslim South African of Malay origin, while integrating my small identity with a bigger national identity. And those are the challenges that we are working through. We've got to reconstruct our identity, our mode of coexistence. We must understand that what we demand for ourselves, we must be prepared to give to others. That the moment you open the door of discrimination to others, you open it up to yourself. When I want a mosque in New York, I must fight for a church in Saudi Arabia. Those are the tests of consistency that I think we need to face as we go forward. And there must also be a material basis to reconstruction and development. We may not compensate each one, and we've chosen not to compensate each one in South Africa for the piece of land that you lost, the house that you lost, the income that you lost. It will be an impossible task, because we will take all our fiscus, spend it on that, and have no money for the general reconstruction of our country. But we created the safety net so that no one is indignified by a severe degree of poverty than they need to be. So how do you make the compensation collective but meaningful and not necessarily individual, especially when there's not the wherewithal for each one to be compensated individually? Most importantly, the most important shift in identity through this entire process is to divest yourself of the identity of victim. Victims can't negotiate. They can only trade victimhood. Victims can't decide. They can only compete on whose victimhood is greater. And that's a zero-sum game. Victims can't be agents, because they've given up their autonomy to a greater emotion than what is needed to direct your life as you go forward. And so, I think, and this is really where I want to end on a scriptural note, one of the key mantras that come from the Quran that I've grown up with is in Arabic, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحٍ. When God says in the Quran, I have blown of my spirit into you. I was surprised when I read one of the epistles of St. John, which says, who lives in love lives in God and God in them. And it ends with, this you must know, I have given you of my Spirit. And then, when I read somewhere from the Torah, God describing that I have blown of my Spirit through your nostrils. How is it that all of us who share an Abrahamic tradition have the same idea of what is the core ingredient of this body that we have here? That each one of us have been invested with a portion of the divine, because the core ingredient is that Spirit that has been blown into us. And we are learning in South Africa how not to see each other's color, but to see the divine in each other. How not to see how each one prays, but to see the divine at work in each one of us. How not to look at the culture of each one only, but to see how the divine expresses itself in manifold cultures. How not to judge on the language that we hear, but to hear the divine speaking whenever they speak. And that really is where I think we need to respond from. We need to see not the enemy, but appeal to the divine in the one who today may be our enemy. Because the reason that that divine is within us is because there is always in each one of us a moral compass to which we can appeal. We can never give up on human beings for as long as they are carriers of a portion of the divine and share it with us. Thank you very much.